Picture this. You're gathering water from a stream near your coastal village on a quiet morning in the year 821. The monastery bells haven't yet rung for prayers. Your children are still asleep in your small home. Then, you hear it. A sound that turns your blood to ice. The scraping of wooden hulls against beach stones, shouts in a foreign tongue, the clash of steel. By the time you turn to run, rough hands are already grabbing you, dragging you towards ships with carved dragon heads rising from their prows. Within hours, everything you've ever known will be behind you. Within days, you'll be standing naked on a platform in a bustling trade city, examined like livestock while strangers bid on your body. Within weeks, you'll understand that death during the raid would have been a mercy. This was the reality for tens of thousands of women during the Viking Age, and what happened to them after capture reveals one of history's darkest chapters. When we think of Vikings today, we often imagine fierce warriors sailing across icy seas, discovering new lands, or dying gloriously in battle to earn their place in Valhalla. Popular culture has given us a romanticized vision of Norse culture, complete with noble shield maidens fighting alongside men and honorable codes of warfare. The reality was far grimmer. The Vikings were slavers on a massive scale, and the kidnapping, sale, and forced exploitation of human beings, particularly women, was not a side effect of their raiding culture. It was a central pillar of their entire economic system. For nearly 3 centuries, from the late 8th century to the 11th century, Viking raiders systematically targeted communities across Europe, and women were among their most prized commodities. Recent archaeological research and careful examination of historical sources have begun to reveal the full scope of this brutal trade, and what emerges is a picture that challenges every comfortable assumption we might hold about Viking society. The Viking Age officially began on June 8, 793, when foreign warriors attacked the Christian monastery of Lindisfarne on the English coast. They slaughtered the monks, looted the treasure, and set a pattern that would repeat across Europe for generations. But according to archaeologist Neil Price of Uppsala University, Viking expansion likely began even earlier and was driven by a calculated economic motive: the need for captive labor and overseas wives. This wasn't mindless violence or impulsive raiding. This was a coordinated response to labor shortages in Scandinavia and an unbalanced sex ratio among Viking populations. Some historians, including James Barrett of Cambridge University, believe selective female infanticide was practiced in pagan Scandinavian society, creating an artificial shortage of women. This demographic imbalance meant that average Viking men, unable to afford the bride prices demanded by elite families, turned to raiding as a way to acquire women by force. When the Annals of Ulster recorded in 821 that Vikings plundered an Irish village and carried off a great number of women into captivity, this wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard operating procedure. Women weren't just valuable for reproduction or companionship. They were skilled laborers essential to the Viking economy, particularly in textile production. A single Viking ship required 2 massive woolen sails, and each sail demanded up to 5 years of labor to produce. With fleets numbering in the hundreds of ships by the 9th century, the demand for textile workers was staggering. Slave labor wasn't just useful, it was necessary. The capture itself was traumatic beyond measure. Viking raids typically struck at dawn, or during times when men were away at markets or working distant fields. They moved with terrifying speed, overwhelming small communities before organized resistance could form. Historical accounts describe scenes of absolute chaos: buildings set ablaze, livestock slaughtered, valuables stripped from homes and churches, and people sorted into those who would die and those who would be taken. Women and girls were primary targets, but the selection was brutally pragmatic. The very young and very old were often killed immediately. Pregnant women might be spared, or might be murdered depending on the raider's mood and the stage of pregnancy. Women of childbearing age, especially those who appeared healthy and strong, were seized and bound. Teenage girls were particularly valued. One account describes Vikings specifically targeting young, educated males from monasteries to be castrated and sold as eunuchs to Eastern markets. But women faced their own specialized horror. Resistance was not just futile, it was punished with extreme violence. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains shows that captured individuals often bore signs of severe trauma. Broken bones, cuts from being dragged, and evidence of brutal restraint. Iron collars and shackles found at Viking trading centers in Birka, Hedeby, and Dublin tell us these captives were bound in metal, treated as the dangerous commodities they represented to their captors. The journey from raid site to slave market could take weeks or months depending on the destination. Captive women were chained together in the cargo holds of Viking ships, exposed to the elements with minimal food and water. The conditions were designed not for their comfort but for their survival just long enough to reach a buyer. Some didn't make it. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Viking traders on the Volga River in 922, noted that if a slave died during transport, the Vikings would simply leave the body as food for dogs and birds. There was no ceremony, no dignity, no acknowledgement of humanity. For the women who survived the voyage, the destination might be a bustling trading hub where they would be sold to the highest bidder. Dublin became one of the most significant slave trading centers in northwestern Europe. Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden also thrived on the commerce of human beings. Archaeological excavations at these sites have uncovered iron shackles and collars, physical evidence of the thousands who passed through these markets in chains. Other captives were taken even further, transported along the Volga trade route into Russia and beyond, where they would be sold to Muslim merchants in exchange for Arab silver dirhams. Women from Ireland and Scotland ended up as far away as Central Asia and the Middle East, never to see their homelands again. Life as a thrall, the Old Norse word for slave, was existence stripped of every human right. In Norwegian legal language, slaves were referred to using the neuter gender, the same grammatical category used for objects and animals. Free people were given the masculine gender. This wasn't just a quirk of grammar, it reflected a worldview that saw enslaved people as cattle, as advanced domestic animals. Thralls could own nothing, inherit nothing, leave nothing. They worked without pay, though in rare circumstances they might be allowed to keep a tiny portion of proceeds from goods they sold for their masters, theoretically making it possible, though extremely rare, for a thrall to eventually purchase freedom. Most never did. Their lives were spent in backbreaking labor, textile production for women, tree cutting and ship construction for men, domestic work for all. They typically lived in the darkest, coldest end of their master's longhouse, sharing space with actual livestock. If they failed to work hard enough or displeased their owners in any way, they were beaten. An owner could punish his slaves as much as he wanted, and Norse law offered them no protection. Their bodies were available for their master's use in every conceivable way. This included, of course, sexual exploitation. The sexual exploitation of captured women was systematic and multifaceted. Ibn Fadlan's observations are particularly revealing and disturbing. He described how Viking traders on the Volga would publicly have intercourse with their female slaves while conducting business, sometimes with other merchants looking on, sometimes in groups. When a merchant came to buy a slave girl, the current owner might be in the act of raping her, but business would proceed regardless. The woman's consent, her humanity, her suffering, none of it mattered. These women served as concubines for their masters, available on demand. In Viking society's rigid hierarchy, wealthy and powerful men often had multiple wives and numerous enslaved concubines. This polygynous system meant that lower-status Viking men struggled to find partners, which drove more raiding and more captive-taking in a vicious cycle. Genetic evidence supports this pattern. DNA analysis of the modern Icelandic population reveals that up to 2/3 of Iceland's female founding population had Gaelic origins from Ireland or Scotland, while only 1/3 had Nordic roots. The reverse was true for males. 2/3 were Nordic. This stark imbalance tells us that many Nordic men in Iceland fathered children with women who were almost certainly taken in raids from the British Isles. These weren't love stories. These were the genetic fingerprints of systematic sexual violence and forced relationships spanning generations. Perhaps the most disturbing fate awaiting some captured women was human sacrifice. Ibn Fadlan provided the most detailed eyewitness account we have of a Viking chieftain's funeral, and it remains one of the most horrifying documents in medieval history. When a wealthy chief died, his possessions were divided into thirds: one part for his family, one part for funeral garments, and one part to purchase alcohol that would be consumed during the days leading up to his cremation. Then his enslaved people would be gathered, and a question would be asked: who will die with him? This wasn't optional volunteerism in any meaningful sense. Cultural and religious pressure made refusal nearly impossible, and once someone agreed, there was no backing out. The commitment was binding. According to Ibn Fadlan, it was usually a woman who volunteered. Over the following days, this doomed slave girl would be kept drunk, her feet washed by 2 attendants who likely served as much as guards as caretakers, ensuring she didn't flee. On the day of the funeral, the woman would participate in ritual acts, being lifted over a doorframe multiple times to see visions of the afterlife. Then she would be taken into a tent on the funeral ship where 6 men would rape her in sequence. After this ordeal, she would be laid beside her dead master. 2 men would hold her hands, 2 would hold her feet, and a woman known as the Angel of Death would place a cord around the girl's neck. While 2 men strangled her with the cord, the Angel of Death would repeatedly stab her between the ribs with a broad-bladed dagger. Then the entire ship would be set ablaze, burning the girl's body along with her master's corpse, various animal sacrifices, and all his possessions. This wasn't an isolated practice. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia confirms that human sacrifice at elite burials was relatively common, and the victims were almost always enslaved people. The children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status. If a free Viking man impregnated his female thrall, he could choose to acknowledge the child, in which case the child would be free. If he declined to acknowledge paternity, the child remained enslaved. This created generations of hereditary thralls who knew no other existence. Some of these children, particularly those raised alongside their master's legitimate offspring, might become foster or fostra, privileged thralls who had slightly better treatment and limited rights, but they were still fundamentally unfree. They could be sold, though only in front of witnesses. They could potentially marry free people, and in that case, their children would be born free. But the foster themselves remained bound to their masters throughout their lives. For women born into slavery, the cycle was nearly impossible to escape. They would work, bear children who might also be enslaved, and eventually die without ever experiencing freedom. The children and grandchildren of freed thralls would eventually gain full rights of the freeborn, but that was multiple generations away, assuming freedom ever came at all. The end of Viking slavery didn't arrive because the Vikings decided they had gone too far or developed a moral awakening. It came from external pressure, primarily the spread of Christianity. As Christian theology took hold in Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries, new ideas about human souls and human dignity began to challenge the old order. If all people had souls equal before God, the logic went, then treating fellow Christians as property became theologically problematic. The church actively discouraged Christians from enslaving other Christians, which gradually reduced the available supply of slaves as Europe became more uniformly Christian. Economic changes also played a role. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, it became more profitable for large landowners to rent their lands to free farmers than to work them with slave labor. The combination of Christian rhetoric against slavery and changing economic incentives gradually phased out the institution. In Norway, slavery appears to have ended by the time Magnus Lagabøte's national law code was issued in 1274, which no longer recognized slavery's existence. Sweden abolished slavery county by county throughout the 13th century, with the last county banning it in 1335. But even as slavery formally ended, its legacy persisted. The women who had been captured, exploited, and brutalized were mostly forgotten by history. They left no written records because they weren't expected to. Their thoughts, their suffering, their individual stories were considered irrelevant to the histories written by free men. What happened to captured women during the Viking Age forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about civilizations we often romanticize. The Vikings were remarkable sailors, skilled craftsmen, and successful traders. They were also systematic slavers who built their economy on the forced labor and sexual exploitation of thousands of human beings. The women taken in raids lost everything: their homes, their families, their freedom, their dignity, and often their lives. Some were worked to death. Some died in childbirth bearing their captors' children. Some were strangled and stabbed to death at their masters' funerals so they could serve in the afterlife. The survivors lived as property, their bodies used however their owners desired, their children born into the same bondage. Genetic evidence tells us their descendants live among us today, carrying in their DNA the proof of generations-old trauma. Archaeological evidence shows us the shackles that bound them, the trading centers where they were sold, the graves where they were sacrificed. Historical sources, when examined carefully and honestly, reveal systematic brutality on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few bad actors. This was the foundation of Viking society, as essential to their way of life as longships and raiding. Understanding this history matters because it shows us that brutality and sophistication can coexist, that cultures we admire can simultaneously commit terrible atrocities, and that the suffering of the enslaved deserves to be remembered even when they left no written records themselves. The women who were captured, enslaved, and forgotten were real people with thoughts, feelings, families, and dreams. They endured what we can barely imagine, and they deserve to be more than footnotes in the saga of Viking expansion. If this dark chapter of history has given you a new perspective on the Viking Age, hit that like button and subscribe to the Codex of History for more deep dives into the hidden truths of the past. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what aspect of this history surprised you most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.